Softwhite Underbelly is about giving people a space to tell their stories, even when these stories challenge what we think we know. Ground News shows us different perspectives in the media, which is why Ground News is a perfect sponsor for my channel. In a world where algorithms censor much of the information we receive, some of the most important stories get missed from our news feeds. Ground News highlights local news from around the world, giving you an on-the-ground perspective that national coverage might miss. The app and website empowers you to form your own opinions by presenting you with every article published on any news story worldwide. My favorite part of the app is the data it gives you on each news source as you read it, such as where it leans on the political spectrum, a factuality rating indicating how subjective their printed reporting tends to be, and who funds it. I particularly like their blind spot feed, dedicated to showing you news stories that are underrepresented in the mainstream media. You can check this all out by scanning the QR code on screen or clicking the link below. It's easy to forget how much bias can shape the reality we live in. And in a world where our attention is constantly being fought over, my Vantage plan easily helps me keep up with more important stories slipping through the cracks. So I encourage you to check them out at ground.news/SWU. Subscribe through my link to save 40% off their Vantage plan. And by subscribing or even gifting it to someone you know, you're helping hold the media accountable and helping my channel directly. Thank you for watching.
So born and raised in Chicago, West Side, Cicero, which is a Mexican hood in Chicago. And I actually was born and my parents decided that they wanted us to grow up in Mexico. So I'm the youngest of three. So we moved to Mexico, to Guadalajara for 5 years. I spent 5 years in Mexico learning the culture. Our parents didn't want us to be Americanized Mexicans. So we ended up going to Guadalajara for 5 years. So went to school for 5 years, well, what's considered preschool. But the most memorable thing for me when I was young was my mom was such a hustler. She convinced the nuns at the Catholic school to let me go into kindergarten as a 3-year-old. And I don't know what my mom told those nuns, but all I know is that I was a 3-year-old in a 5-year-old class. And they let me sit there. And they said, listen, just let her sit there. Even if she is not doing the work, let her do the work. And I'll never forget. I don't know if my mom paid them or what she said or what she did, but I was in school at 3. And I was a quiet kid. I was quiet, but I was also very rambunctious and I was very curious. And of course, the school is called San Rafael, and there was a picket fence outside of the school. And one day I decided to climb the picket fence, and my mom drove up, she honked the horn, and we were on top of the fence. And I remember looking back like that, and my arm went down like this, and the picket went through my arm. And so I looked down, and there was blood splattering everywhere. And then all I remember was I got rushed to the hospital and I had no emotion at all. And I didn't know why I didn't have any emotion. My arm was on the tray, the silver tray, and there was all this skin hanging off. And so the doctor just cut it off. And I remember looking at the piece of skin thinking, and watching it shrivel up because it was dead. And thinking to myself, I feel just like this piece of skin because I felt dead inside. And I'll never forget this. I was sexually molested by the brother who at the time was probably 10 or 12. I was 3, the neighbor who was my friend. And I'll never forget this. We were playing hide and seek, and I was hiding and he found me and he started groping me. And I was 3 years old, and I'll never forget this. He whispered in my ear, if you tell anybody, I will kill your family. And in that moment, I feel like I died as a 3-year-old. That when that accident happened, that was my first indication of how I started to deal with trauma in my life, where I just became numb to life. So I didn't say anything to anybody about the molestation. Later on, when I was 17, when I spoke it out loud, my sister said the same thing happened to her. So That was life in Mexico. Mexico was a lot of fun. We lived in what we call a vecindario, which is kind of like the block in Spanish, right? And everybody on the block knew each other. My dad was a locksmith. He had his own business. My mom was a stay-home mom. We had a beautiful house. It was yellow, I remember. And we lived pretty well. We never really needed anything. We never were in a position where there wasn't anything around for us. But I'll never forget this when my mom said we're moving to the U.S. And I remember being excited but being scared because we didn't know how to speak English. But the English that we did hear was from the satellite that my dad had bought us and put on top of the house. It was like a giant plate. Back then, this was luxury. But so we would watch the Chickmunks and stuff like that in English, and we would pick up some English. But when we moved to the U.S., I'll never forget this. My mom put us on a plane, my brother, me, and my sister. I was 5, my sister was 7, my brother was 11. And she said, all right, guys, see you on the other side. And we went on the plane ride by ourselves. That was the first time I had been on a plane all by myself with no parents, nobody. So we get to the U.S. and we moved into the basement of one of our mom's and dad's friends in Cicero. Rough neighborhood. This is probably like the worst Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the world. So I remember thinking, there's just Mexicans everywhere. There wasn't any whites, there wasn't any Indians, there wasn't any blacks. This is a Mexican neighborhood. And I'll never forget this. We went from this beautiful yellow house to this basement apartment. And just that transition was weird because how do you go from a big house to a small apartment? But as a child, you don't understand that coming to this country is totally different. My parents had to work different jobs and they had to build in order for us to be in a nice neighborhood. But there was this crazy, ugly furnace in that basement that terrified me for years. It was those old school furnaces that would make all those noise, kind of like the Home Alone furnace from the basement, just like that. And there was a crack in it. And I remember as a 5-year-old turning 6, I would have nightmares of this thing exploding and just eating us up at night. But I hated this thing and we had to live with it. And it was so stressful, but that's what it was. And I never, other than the trauma of going through molestation and having this injury, I was never exposed to any violence until I moved into Cicero. And I remember somebody was shot at night and they were bleeding. I was in bed, so we just heard the noises. In the morning, we woke up and we saw bloody footprints from the front of the house coming all the way to the back of the house. And I remember my sister and I and my brother looking at the bloody prints and trying to formulate a story. What happened? Why do they look like this? Why are they going this way? Some of them seemed like they were on tippy toes. And as children, to try to kind of de-stress the storyline, we would make up stories. But we knew that this person had been shot and was running away. And I think that was my first indication that we were living in a neighborhood where we had to watch where we were going. And we never questioned it. We never said anything. And it was almost like we knew that our parents were working and that they were trying to give us a better life, but we never questioned anything. So when I turned 6, I started kindergarten. And the worst thing ever was I went in a class and I didn't know the language. Everybody was speaking English. I was looking around terrified and confused. Why am I in this class? And that's my first instance that I understood what racism was. All the white kids were calling me Pippi Longstocking because my mom would braid my hair and I have freckles. And I didn't realize, I was like, what is this Pippi Longstocking? I didn't know what that was. So I would come home and I'd tell my mom, please don't braid my hair. These kids are calling me Pippi Longstocking and I don't know what it means. And so My mom goes to the school and she's like, I think my daughter's in a wrong class. She needs to be in a bilingual class. And this was Cicero Elementary. They said, it's fine, she'll learn the language. And sure enough, I did. I picked it up pretty quickly. But I started realizing that in the neighborhood where we were, there was gunshots. There was drive-bys. There was always shots that we would hear. And I'll never forget this. The teachers would say, just go under the desk. And so that became our norm, is to just go under the desk all the way up till 6th grade. I remember this was our norm, that gunshots were going to be part of our daily routine. And when you heard something like that, you just went under the desk. And again, it's like the trauma kept building up. But I think as a child, I grew to understand that sometimes you just turn away trauma and you forget it and you dig it away in the depths of your mind and in your heart, not knowing that later on something could happen and trigger it to come out. So I remember, I think it was probably about 4th grade, my parents had gotten enough money to move, still in Cicero, but now we owned our own house. And so we moved into a duplex, and my parents rented the 1st floor, and then we were living in the 2nd floor. And that seemed like a nicer place that we were living in, but it was only a few blocks away from where we were. But again, an upgrade. So all was good. And we went to school, gunshots. We were latchkey kids. My parents worked so much that we had to get up on our own. We had to get up, we had to get ready, we had to go to school, we had to walk ourselves to school. And I always think back, oh my God, nobody stole us, nobody raped us, nobody took us, because we would walk about 2 miles to school, me, my sister, and my brother. And for us, it was the norm. And there was no buses. We would just walk. We would get ready. Same thing at home. We would come home. We would make ourselves sandwiches and wait till my mom got home. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, we never burnt the house down or did anything crazy, but we survived. Because nowadays, CPS would get called for leaving kids alone for so long. But needless to say, I think early on, we saw that our parents were working very difficult and very long hours, and they were trying to give us a better life. But in my mind, I was like, how is this a better life when we're living in these like little apartments and duplexes compared to the beautiful house that we had in Mexico? So, but it's different, and it's relative to being raised in a different environment. So during 6th grade, my parents, working so hard, earned enough money and saved enough money to move to the nice side of Cicero, which was the last block before the white neighborhood. So we lived on 61st Court, which was the last block before Berwyn started. And we had this beautiful house, and it was amazing. It was a 2-floor house, and we had the stairs and the basement and the attic. It was probably the best house that we could have ever had. So I had to go to a new school in 6th grade. And I don't know what happened in the midst of moving and starting 6th grade, but middle school sucks, because what happened, and this is crazy, and people will remember this. So we moved to the nicer school, the nicer side of Cicero, but Cicero was so gang infested that they had to separate all the gang kids from the bad neighborhood of the bad side of Cicero to the nice side of Cicero, because there were so many killings happening. So my parents moved us to the nice side of Cicero, and then all the freaking gang members are now getting bused to this school because they were trying to remove the gang members from the heart of Cicero and put them as far as possible. The district apparently thought that if we move them further, less shootings would happen. Yeah, that wasn't the case. So we have all these bus kids coming into the nicer school of Cicero, which just meant more trips under the desk. And I'll never forget this. I was in 8th grade, 7th grade, and same thing. shots fired. You could hear the windows breaking and glass being splattered everywhere, and everybody just going under the table. And I'll never forget this. We had an English teacher. She was white. She's like, this fucking shit again. And it was like, and then I look at her, like, she's used to this. She's understanding what's happening. And again, it was one of those things where it became the norm. Gunshots was a daily thing, and we just had to go under the desk. And then the windows had to get replaced probably every other month. So yeah, it was crazy. So graduated middle school, went to high school, and high school is crazy. I went to Morton East. At the time I went to Morton East, we had the highest pregnancy rate in the country. It was cool to be pregnant in Morton East. In fact, so many people were getting pregnant that they started a child development course and a whole daycare. So if you got pregnant, you just went and dropped off the baby and went to class. And it was something that I would say almost encouraged, because nobody said anything. Everybody would be happy. So it was like the golden ticket at 16. Everybody was pregnant. So it's insane. It was insane. And I'll never forget this. My father would tell us, because I grew up in a traditional Mexican Catholic family where nothing is spoken about. We don't talk about sex. We don't talk about anything. All we knew is if you had sex, the ground would open and it would swallow you. That's how we were raised. So again, everybody getting pregnant around. I remember we had dispensers, condom dispensers in the bathrooms, like it was the norm. And I'm sure everybody was having sex. If it wasn't in the bathroom, it was in their houses, it was in the locker rooms. Apparently, it was just a highly sexually charged environment. But as I got older, I started realizing that most of these kids in the school come from immigrant families where their parents were absent because they were never around. They were always working. So these kids were left alone to have sex, do drugs, join gangs. And there was a sense of wanting to belong. So a lot of the kids that went to the school would go into gangs because it made them belong or feel like they were part of a family that they yearned to have because they didn't have it at home. So all of our parents were working. And I'll never forget this. One of my friends was terrified, and I didn't realize this because my parents had already gotten their citizenship. But most of these parents were illegal, and they lived in fear of being deported. And even then, this was over 30 years ago, they were still living in fear of being deported because they were illegal immigrants in this country. But again, very violent school, lots of gangs, lots of shootings, lots of things that were happening. Again, it became the norm. This was already something that was embedded in our being, that we lived in an area of high gang activity. So I would say probably my sophomore year is when I thought that my life came crashing down. I never thought that dying would be a better choice than living as a 16-year-old. So 16 years old, I fell in love, first high school sweetheart. I'll never forget this. And we were together, life was great, everything was good. He was an athlete, I was an athlete. And then in the summer of 99, his sister was murdered, dismembered, and decapitated by the gangs and the Mexican cartel. I'll never forget hearing him say, my sister is missing. She went missing for 2 weeks. She went on a first date with a guy that she had met. This was a first date. Back then, we didn't have iPhones. We didn't have computers. I think AOL had just started, where you dial up and it made all that crazy noise. So she met a guy. They went out on a first date. She went missing for 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, they found his leg floating in the Chicago River. And the only way they were able to identify him was because he had a tattoo of a heart that said mom. And so the authorities literally said, hey, we found a leg. A fisherman in the Chicago River found a leg. And is this anybody's kid? So the family came forward and said, yeah, that's our son. Probably days later, they ended up finding her fingers, her legs, her arms, and eventually her head. Her head had been so decayed that you couldn't identify her. And the only way that they identified her was because she was wearing braces. And I'll never forget this. It's still chilling to me how somebody can do this to another human being. So I'm 15, he's 16, he's going through the trauma, I'm going through the trauma. We break up. When somebody tells you that this happened to somebody, you don't know how to process it. And as a 15-year-old, you don't even know how to tell yourself, how does this happen? And then you start thinking about the process and the ways that this happened. So apparently, the guy she was dating owed them money. And I want to say it was like $2,000. And he lured him in to an apartment and he told her, hey, I'm going to go do some quick business. He went in, the guy shot him in the head and dragged him into the bathroom. He was dead. So he comes back and gets her from the car and says, hey, we're going to hang out a little bit. Can you come back to the upstairs? And she's like, okay. He does the same to her. He shoots her, but she doesn't die. She's still struggling. And it probably took me about 10 years after the case finished for me to be able to read through the transcripts in detail of what he did to them. And he explains how she wouldn't die. She had in her head and she was still crawling for her life, praying for her life, and she wouldn't die. And she was just fighting for her life. And he then took and she was still talking and she was still praying and she was still moving. And he explained how he couldn't kill her. And he had never seen somebody that had so much will to live. So finally, he grabs her by the knife because the knife was stuck. Once she's dead, moves her body into the tub. And after that, and one of the things that sticks out is that it's very cartel to chop up bodies into pieces, but they wanted to make sure that they were saying, hey, don't fuck with us. And so he took all these different bags of body pieces and he dispersed them all over Chicago, north side, south side, west side, to kind of tell them, hey, you owe us money and this is what's going to happen. So I'll never forget this. They never found her torso. So the family just collected the body parts that they had of her and they put it in a box and they had a funeral. Obviously it was closed casket, but I couldn't even go. I was so sick to my stomach trying to process what had happened to my boyfriend's sister and how us as 15, 16-year-olds will ever get over this. So I went through this horrible depression. I couldn't sleep. I was having nightmares. I couldn't wake up. I was seeing things. I was hearing things. I was going crazy. And my parents didn't understand what depression was. And my parents didn't know how to deal with it. So they said, oh, everything's going to be fine. Just walk it off. And I'll never forget, I was falling asleep in one of my classes and my Spanish teacher said to me, she pulled me aside. I was losing weight. I was probably 20 pounds under. And she said, you're depressed. There's something wrong with you. You need help. And I said, depressed? I don't know what depressed means. That is not a word that my family ever discussed, or we even knew what that was. So she calls my mom, and my mom's like, she's fine. She's just going through some things. And I think our parents went through trauma, but they just never knew how to deal with it. And they didn't know how to process it. So their best way of dealing with it was just forget about it. Just everything's fine. Let's just sweep it under the rug. And the rug is full of these lumps. And you walk on the lumps and nobody says anything. Everybody just is supposed to be fine with all this awkwardness. So 16 years old, at this point I'm suicidal because I feel like I can't deal with the sadness, the stress. I can't deal with the not sleeping. When you don't sleep, you go insane and you start thinking all these different things and you start understanding that maybe it's not meant for this lifetime. And I always say this to people that are suicidal. If you believe that taking your life is a better option than living, you have passed the threshold of loving your life and understanding what depression is. Depression will take your life if you don't handle it. So at 16, my teacher told my mom she needs therapy. My mom's like, what's therapy? There's no such thing. What, you think talking to somebody is going to help her? And she said, yes. And I will never forget this. I ended up in therapy and it was the best thing of my life. I actually was so depressed and so suicidal. My mom ended up finding out a conversation of me and my best friend writing letters. We had actually told ourselves that we were going to sit in a car, turn it on with the garage door closed. And we literally were thinking, this is probably the best way to go in our sleep, no blood, no brains blown up, and our parents can see us as we're asleep. And I never thought that I would say this or even think this, but it just seemed like the best option. She wanted to hang herself. And by the way, her depression came because she got pregnant at 15. And she ended up being like the disgrace of her family. And I remember she tried hanging herself and her mom walked in on her as soon as she hung herself. So she ends up in an inpatient program. I end up in an inpatient program because my mom found that letter. And here we are in the inpatient program. So I was removed from school and I was in an inpatient program for a year. And I'll never forget this. The kids in this program were brilliant. These kids that were dealing with depression were probably the most magnificent, intelligent beings I had ever been exposed to, because they thought so much about things that they got so depressed and they ruminated so much and they just overthought everything. And I remember, damn, you guys are smart. You guys will probably be engineers and work for NASA or amazing artists, because there was just these deep conversations being had in this inpatient program. And I'll never forget when I told my story to them, they just nodded, because a lot of these kids had been through some serious trauma, rape, drug abuse, their parents or somebody close to them raping them. So it almost felt like I was home in a weird way. But I remember in those rooms, it came out of my mouth, I was molested as a 3-year-old. And it took me 12 years for me to be able to say those words. And it was just all this weight was lifted off of me, because I was able to tell what was going on and almost remove layers that had piled up of trauma at the age of 16. But I always say this, it was crazy to me to sit around in a room and have group therapy and think these are some amazing, magnificent, brilliant people, because they were telling their stories and they were being so honest and so vulnerable. And we all grew up in an era or in an environment where we were told to keep our mouths shut. So that was probably like the best thing ever. So based on this pain, I decided that I was going to go to school and study forensic psychology. And I wanted to know why somebody can take lives in a matter that this man did. I knew that the story was he was part of the cartel. They were part of another gang, and he was practically the assassin of the cartel. And a crazy thing about this that I'm going to throw in here was Jay Flores and Peter Flores grew up in the same neighborhood I did. And we knew each other from separate friends. And so I grew up in a working class family that was grinding, and they grew up in the cartel. And they really had no choice because their dad was part of the cartel, so they didn't know any better. So Peter and Jay went to join the cartel because they grew up in it. I went to school, got my bachelor's in forensic psychology, came out of school, and I had a couple years before I was able to apply for the feds. You had to be 23 to apply for the feds. So super smart kid. I graduated college in 2 years, and I was a nerd. I was already a sophomore in high school. I was a sophomore in college when I graduated high school. We were very, very smart. But I'll never forget this. In our family, our dad has stressed the fact that there's only two choices that we have. My dad was working at a factory, and he got his hand jammed in a machine, and it cut 3 of his fingers off. And he came home one day. I'll never forget this. He had bandages all over his fingers, and he sat all 3 of us down, and he said, you got 2 choices. You either go to the factory and work your asses off like your mother and I, and this happens to you, or you go get an education. So all 3 of us were, say less. And all 3 of us were very successful. We all have masters. We all went to school, and school became our thing. We had to graduate because our parents had worked so hard in this country to get us into college. And it's crazy because my mom worked 3 jobs. My dad was, after he hurt himself, became a truck driver. They put all 3 of us through college with no debt. I have no idea how they did it, but all 3 of us have degrees and masters and have no debt. So it's incredible what partnership and parenting and saving money will do for people. So back, I want to backtrack a little bit to when the killer of my friend was caught. He said he was not guilty due to insanity. He tried to say the voices in my head. He tried to say I'm crazy. I had a horrible childhood. Listen, we all had horrible childhoods. And the judge who gave him his death sentence because he got the death penalty, that was Judge Lampkin in Cook County. And I'll never forget this because she sent him to death, and that case was so horrible. One of the worst horrific cases in Chicago history. I remember she said this when she said you are sentenced to death. She said, in my entire career, I've only given the death sentence twice, and this one is probably the one that's deserved the most. The crazy thing is, in 2006, the governor abolished the death penalty in Illinois, so he still sits on death row. But going back, when I graduated college, I had 2 years before I can apply to the FBI and to the feds, so I had to go do something else. So I went and did criminal counseling, which is I was counseling all the people from Cook County that were unfit to stand trial because it fit the genre of my forensic psychology. And I'll never forget this. I walked in, and it was Judge Lampkin who was going to be our supervisor, and my jaw dropped because I was thinking, how does this happen? And I remember she looked at me and she said, you look like you saw a ghost. And I just mentioned Janet Mena, and she was like, oh. And I said, I was 16 when that happened, and I'm here to learn. And she just said that was the toughest case of my career. So now I'm counseling people that are insane unfit to stand trial, and the state of Illinois sends them to a medical facility or a mental health facility where they pretty much remain their entire lives there. And so I became a counselor where I try to get information out of them and try to understand why they're so crazy. So a very interesting job, but I felt that, and I always say this, I think people choose their jobs based on their pain. At least I did. I picked something that I felt would heal my trauma and would heal, or I would be able to give back to the community. And I'll never forget this. These people are so highly medicated. They're the real life zombies. They really are. They just walk around so highly medicated because they're such a threat to society. And they're locked away in these state facilities that are funded by the US or the states. And there's just so many of them. And they have horrendous crimes. I remember dealing with two people, one that had a serial killer that had killed people and ate them. So we were dealing with another Jeffrey Dahmer. Apparently that's a thing in Chicago. I don't know why. And then another guy who had set his boss on fire because he had fired him. So even that story was crazy. But I'll never forget this. I went in for a counseling session, and we'll call him Bob. He was in for serial murders, and I was supposed to go do an intake because they say that as a killer progresses in their therapy, their memories start to come back and they remember more of the details of their killings. Well, I don't know. Bob seemed a little bit too bright-eyed this day, and he didn't seem too zombie-like. And I'll never forget this. I don't even remember what question I asked, but it triggered him. And we didn't call them prisoners, we called them patients. They weren't locked down in shackles or anything. And I'll never forget this. He got up and lunged towards me and grabbed my neck. And he had these big hands and they were rough. And I'll never forget this. He had my neck and we fell back, and I can hear his teeth grinding, and I can hear almost like his grunting, and I can feel the hotness of his breath. He was strangling me to death. And I didn't lose consciousness, but I just remembered hitting my little button. They would give us a necklace with a button. And I just remembered the security coming in and getting him off of me. And I remember having his hands around my neck. And I have been so used to trauma at this point. I was 21. The guys were like, "Oh my God, this is horrible." And I'm like, "It's fine. He's just having a rough day." Which seemed as now I was becoming what our parents would tell us when we were going through trauma. "Oh, you're just having a bad day." And so I remember having those hands around my neck probably for a couple of days and just not thinking anything of it. So yeah, so then turn 23, go into the feds, go into the academy, dealing with the craziness of training as a Latina in a male-dominant world, trying to get into the government to work what I thought was going to be my healing process, and it definitely wasn't. I think I just got used to trauma, and it was now part of who I was, that I could just deal with trauma. I was untouchable. I was so numb that nothing could penetrate my mind nor my heart. And I felt that because I dealt with my trauma early on, I almost became this amazing person that I could just take on anything. The things that they put you through during these trainings is crazy. I'll say two things, but one of them is they kidnap you in the middle of the night and they put you in the woods in hopes that you'll be able to find yourself back with no shoes. And this is building your mental strength, but it's also building your directional strength, and it's building what do you do in a process of trauma. They put you in rooms where you watch people getting beheaded to mentally strengthen you. And I remember thinking, this isn't bad, guys. This happened to my friend. But I remember looking around, people crying and throwing up and saying, this is not going to be as easy as we thought. So get out, go through training, and I ask, I want to be a profiler. What's the fastest way to be a profiler? And they said, well, you have to do undercover. And it's not easy, it's not enjoyable, and most of their undercover agents end up dead anyway. You literally have to sign your life away, and people don't realize that. People do it. I did it. So I did undercover work for 2 years. I was doing corporate fraud, so I'm now working undercover. And when I say undercover, because people think that I was actually in the mist, I was in the mist, but my undercover work was old school. I was in the bushes with the camera. I was in the side of the building. I was on the roof. I was there. Now, undercover work, we could just sit in our house and hack you. We didn't have that technology back in the day. My undercover work was the original sliding down the side of the building, Angeli style. Like, that was the real stuff. And it's nothing like 007. Don't believe the movies. We're not driving around in Lambos. We're literally shitting and pissing on ourselves because we can't leave our target, and we're blending into our entire background. So we are not out there with Lambos and Rolexes. It's crazy. So I did that for 2 years. It was probably the most exhilarating time of my life. And I don't say it in a happy way. I say it in a traumatic way. But I earned my stripes. And I'll never forget, I was in upstate New York. My cover was blown. I was taken. And before I was extracted from my van, they tried, and I say they, because there was probably about 5 of them. They tried to crash me off of the side of the mountain into my death, just like the movies. And I remember my car hit the rail, and I said to myself, okay, you have 2 choices. Either die over the rail or die by their hands. Pick one. So I stopped the car and I surrendered. I said, let's go this route. See what happens. And I think in my thought process, and I was right, I thought the government had hired me to do undercover work because I looked so young. I started doing undercover work at 23, but I looked like I was 16. So I thought maybe they'll think I'm a child and they'll have mercy on me. But I have to say, when they pulled me out of the car, I had 10 guns to my head. And I remember, I will never forget this. When you have a gun pointed at your head, you see the barrel of the gun and you work your way up to the hand, work yourself up to the arm and look at their eyes. And in the midst of those 10 guns was a woman. And I said, there's no way that this woman is going to allow a so-called child to be murdered. Well, they took me, and I'll never forget this. We'll do a quick endorsement for Verizon. I had 2 phones at the time. I had my personal phone and my government phone. My government phone was Verizon, and my personal phone was T-Mobile. They grabbed my personal phone, and they smashed it on the ground. I had taken the Verizon phone and put it in my bra, and I said, let's hope that they find me. So back then, the only way that you find a location on a cell phone was if a cell phone pinged off of a tower. So when I was taken by them, my Verizon phone up in the mountains of upstate New York pinged off one building or one tower. And it was because of that one ping I was able to be rescued. So I was taken back. I remember I was beat. I was punched, I was thrown around, but that was actually the best thing that could have happened to me, because most of the time they cut your limbs off so that you can remember, don't do this again. And I was not disfigured. My limbs were not cut off. And because I did look like a child, they let me go and I was rescued. After that incident, and I tell this to people, I did undercover work. I was in your bushes. I wasn't undercover where I was part of the actual dealings of the cartel. I was actually following you around to get footage and get audio for incriminating information. So I was really the old school surveillance agent. And there was one time where I did go undercover, and I remember I went to a hair salon where they were actually putting cocaine in big shampoo bottles and they were storing it in the back. And my undercover mission was I was supposed to go get my hair dyed so that I can set a camera on the counter of when the lady was doing my hair so I can catch footage of them coming in and out with the bottles in the back. And listen, this was old school. So I had a bag and we cut a hole out of the bag and we had a camera in the bag and we set the camera down so that it could catch footage of the activity going on in the back. Nowadays, our cameras are so small, you can place them, you can have them in your pockets, you can have them on the wall, you can wear sunglasses. This was old school. So I remember the lady dyeing my hair and she's like, "Are you from around here?" And I'm like, "No, I'm just visiting, trying to chit chat." And the camera sat there and was recording all the activity in the back. So that was the type of undercover work that I did. And after I was taken, they said, "All right, she's good. She's ready to go." And they said, "All right, now you get a desk job." So thank God, 2 years of all that, I survived. Ended up in Houston. I started doing human trafficking, terrorism, drug dealing, and multi-crime. So like anything that falls under national security. So now I'm in Houston. I remember going to Houston and thinking my parents had already moved to Houston when I was a sophomore in college. And I remember thinking, human trafficking, this is a thing? I didn't even know human trafficking existed in the United States. And they said, "Yeah, Houston is number one. You're going to go interrogate. Now you're going to be the interrogator and you're going to try to get all the information out of people. You're not going to be in the field anymore. And you're going to be able to now really dig into the minds of these killers." And that was probably like music to my ears because I didn't have to be out in the cold, pissing and pooping in buckets of sand, because that's what we did. You couldn't leave your post. So you would be in your post for 24 hours. You couldn't leave. So now I'm getting a desk job. And I remember thinking, this is easy. This is easy because now I just have to talk to people and get into their minds. And I started realizing how good I was at getting into people's minds because I started to listen to them. A lot of these killers and terrorists never had anybody to listen to them. And I would just sit there and say a couple words and they would just tell me their entire stories. And the crazy thing about it is they thought that I was a psychologist. They didn't realize I was actually the interrogator. So I would get them into a space where they can speak their mind and feel heard. And they were self-incriminate themselves without even realizing that they were saying too much because I gave them a space of comfort and a space of being heard. And they said, "Nobody else can do this but you." But I remember thinking back to when I was 21. I had this energy of just softness, and there was nothing that anybody could say that can rattle me because I had been and seen everything already. So there was nothing that you could say or do that was going to get an expression out of me. And I feel like it's a double-edged sword because I go from feeling emotion to not feeling any emotion at all. And I think that's how you have to be to work this type of field. So, yeah. So I did that and became very, very good at that. Did it for many years. Did it for 6 different agencies. and then COVID hits. And I had originally left the government 2013, and I started contracting with other companies because I wanted to expand with different agencies. They were all doing the same thing. COVID hits, and I was already married. So I met my husband. I moved to Houston in 2008. I was 26 years old. Met my husband when I was 28, and seemed like a normal guy. Originally from Houston, handsome, drove a nice car, had a nice job, was doing commercial real estate. And I'll never forget this. We fell in love, and he asked me to marry him after 4 months. And this was the only man that my dad ever liked. I don't know if it's because he was Cuban or he just was on the quieter side, but yeah, we ended up getting engaged after 4 months. We moved in together month 5. We were engaged for 2 years. We got married in 2013. And I thought, this is it. This is going to be my husband, the father of my children. We're going to be very happy together. So we decided to start living together, growing our life together. And we had my daughter. She was an oopsie baby. 2 years in, so we got married 2013. 2014, March of 2014, we were drunk because it was our anniversary, 2-year anniversary, and we had a little bit too much fun. I ended up pregnant. And my daughter was born in 2015, and it was like the best time of my life because it was almost like, now I have a daughter, so I can't be out there doing any crazy stuff anymore. I can't be out there doing this type of work. What if I end up dead or killed? And so I felt like my daughter kind of softened everything in my life. Like, now I have somebody and something and a daughter that I need to take care of. I can't be doing all this traveling. And I remember COVID hits and my 6 contracts get canceled. My husband and I were already having issues. We were dealing with the double standards, and I felt like our relationship was always very transactional, and it was very kind of one up you, and we were always in competition of finances and who's making more money. And there was a lot of red flags in the relationship that I definitely ignored, for sure. The first one was he never wanted to talk about his childhood. He said, we're going to talk about us meeting and everything forward. We're not going to talk about our childhood. So I thought that was a little off. The second thing that I thought was off were her 2 aunts. Their husbands were murdered. And nothing was ever spoken as to why they were murdered. But he said, my one uncle was murdered, dismembered, decapitated, and my other uncle was murdered in his house. And I would question why. But I think I was so in love, and love definitely is blind, because those were my indications that something was up. And I also remember the dad having millions of dollars and owning all this land in Houston, and his father and I never got along. His father was living outside of the country for the 10 years that we were together, and we never got along. He begged my husband not to marry me. In fact, the dad didn't give us any money when we got married. And the day of the wedding, I will never forget this. I had this feeling in my inner being not to marry this man. And I was sweating. I was hyperventilating. I went to my friend that was there. Her name is Gabrielle. And I said, I want to call this wedding off. And she's like, you're just getting cold feet. Everything is fine. And I said, no, something is wrong. And I said, I just feel inside of me that something is wrong. I feel like he's going to end up like his father. And she's like, no, he is not like that. You know, you're just. So because of her, I went along with the marriage and we got married. And when the truth finally came out, she was crying in tears and said, you tried to stop the wedding and I convinced you to go through with it. So COVID hits. I lose my government contracts. And I'll never forget this. I go to him. At this point, we had 2 kids. My son was born in 2018. COVID hit in 2020. I'll never forget this. He says to me, you have to go get a job. He says, you're making too much money and you can't stay home. And of course, this is crazy because I'm like, I thought you were going to support me. I thought you were going to be here for me. He's like, no. So I end up in the wire room at the DEA office, and I'm supervising the wire room at the DEA office, working second shift. During COVID, I started tinkering with the idea of writing the story of my life with all the trauma and Undercover and everything I had gone through. So I get approached by Hasmark International Publishing Company out in Canada. They said, hey, let's write your story. Let's do this thing. It's COVID. Everybody's at home. Everybody wants good books, wants good podcasts. Let's tell your story. So I said, okay, why not? I'm going to say this to say this. It took me 3 weeks to write my book because I had so much pain inside of me and so much trauma that writing it and getting it out of my being was so cathartic for me that I just spilled it out. And in 3 weeks, Through These Brown Eyes came out. I had the transcript. It was ready to go to editing. And my husband says, let me read it before it goes to editing. And I said, sure, here it is. He reads it in a couple of days. And I'll never forget this. I came home one day, second shift, 6 a.m., tired, wanting to go to sleep. And he says to me, I need to talk to you. And I said, about what? Can this wait? I'm tired. He says, no, I need to talk to you. I had my gun at the time. So I had my gun right here. And he sits me down and he tells me, what I'm going to tell you is not going to go well. So I'm thinking, what is he going to tell me? Did he kill somebody? Did he hit somebody? What did you do? So he sits me down and he tells me, I read your book and it triggered me to tell you my truth. And I had no idea of the trauma that you had gone through. So we had been married for 10 years and he never questioned anything in my past because he never wanted to talk about our childhoods. So he tells me, my family and I were part of the Mexican cartel. In that moment, I went like this. I was going to kill him. In a split second, I said, I'm going to kill him and have the government cover it up. Then I stopped and I said, separate wife from your expertise. Interrogate him. So I let go of my gun. I gave him the space to tell me his truth. And I always say, in the 10 years that we were together, this was the most authentic my husband had ever been. And in 2, I literally just said to him, tell me more. And for the next 2 hours, he tells me everything. He grew up in the cartel. His dad was moving drugs. His uncle was moving $1 million worth of cocaine from Texas to Boston and got killed, dismembered, and decapitated. They found his body parts in the Boston harbor, and they stole $1 million worth of the dad's profits. And I remember sitting there thinking, wait a minute, I've been through this before. This happened to my friend when I was 15. And in my mind, I'm like, how did I end up here? How does an agent marry into the cartel? Who dropped the ball? Because the feds did a background on him. Everybody thinks that us agents do backgrounds on our family. We don't. Those are done by other federal agents. They had cleared him.
What did they think he was doing?
This is how I explained to it. People watch too many movies of the movement of drugs, which is mules. They don't realize that the cartel is an entire process, is an entire organization where they hire lawyers, doctors, crossing guards, accountants, in order for their enterprise to work. And they thought, he was in business. He was in commercial real estate business. And in order for you to find out if there is any money laundering or any financial activities or crimes happening, you would have to get a forensic investigator to look at accounts. Accounts I never had access to because he was running his own business. Why would I need to look at his business accounts? He claimed were part. Till this day, there's a lot of ifs and or buts, but he said he grew up in the cartel. His dad was moving drugs for the cartel. When he was in high school, his little truck had different compartments where the dad was putting different, I guess, drugs in these different compartments. And there was a lot of money. There was a lot of women. There was a lot of lying, cheating, and stealing. And he just grew up in this environment. I remember when he was telling me my story, I actually felt for him. And I said to him, he's been holding this back from me for 10 years. And he married me knowing that this could come out and it could potentially end my career and put me and his own children at harm. So in my mind, I thought, how selfish of him. But I understood him because I grew in an environment where drugs and violence and gangs was the norm. So I actually understood where he was coming from. And he said, I never wanted to tell you this because you would have never married me. So in that moment, I'm thinking, I don't know this guy. I literally married the enemy. I have been sleeping with the enemy for the last 10 years. And I made babies with this man. So I tell him, I said, I remember I thanked him for telling me. And I remember him saying, thank you for giving me the space to tell you the truth. And I thought to myself, I'm like, wow, this is the most authentic my husband has ever been in our 10 years of marriage. So then I said to him, I said, I need to report this. Because at this point, it became clear that it was either him or me. I gave an oath to the government that I would not be involved in criminal activity. And if I don't say anything and the calls were tapped or anything was tapped, I would be sitting in federal prison. And people say she's not a ride or die. What people don't realize about cartel wives is that they know they're cartel wives and they choose to be cartel wives. I never chose to be a cartel wife. I married not knowing that they were doing cartel activity. So I have to say this, it took me 2 weeks to report it because 1, I was afraid, 2, I was processing it, and 3, I was trying to figure out, do I stay? Do I leave? Are we going to get killed? What's going to happen? I remember asking him everything under the sun, and I'll never forget this. I remember I ended up in divorce care because I was so fucked up in my head, and I'm sitting at divorce care because I knew I was going to divorce him. And everybody's around talking about infidelity. And I'm sitting thinking, I wished that he would have told me that he had had sex with the barista at Starbucks. And when I told people my story, their jaws were so far down that they were like, damn, my life is not as bad as yours. I'm glad I could do that for you.
Was he making great money?
Yeah. We lived a wonderful life. We lived in a rich neighborhood. We had a beautiful house. We had the timeshare. We had the luxury cars. We had the big diamond rings. We had the 2 acres with the Peruvian tree that we bought. We were both making really good money. I always made money. I had my business. After I left the feds 2013, I started my own company. I was bringing substantial money. And I didn't realize the extent of all the accounts and money that he was hiding. But when I told him I was going to report it, he didn't care. He said, that's fine. And I said, okay. So 2 weeks passed by. I'll never forget this. We were at my son's 3rd birthday party with the Mickey Mouse and the horses and the ponies and all the petting zoo that we had paid for. And my attorney was there, and I told her, and she dropped her plate of food. And she said, you need to get $50,000 out of the accounts in cash as soon as possible, because she knew the feds were going to freeze all accounts and go into full-blown investigation. And I tell her, I said, I have no access to the accounts. I trusted him with our finances. I never even looked into the finances. I never thought about it. It never occurred to me. You know, I wasn't worried about it because I trusted him with the finances. I'll never forget this. I called my supervisor and I told her, and it must have been silent for 3 minutes. She didn't even know what to say. And then when she finally spoke, she said, how the fuck does this happen? And I said, I don't know.
You married the enemy.
I married the enemy. You can't make this shit up. So then she says, this is over my pay rate. She calls her supervisor. Her supervisor doesn't know what to do and calls their supervisor, what ends up being the Pentagon. The Pentagon is now involved. I'll never forget this. I get flown out and I'm interrogated. I'm now sitting on the other side of the interrogation table. 20 years in this field, knowing the ins and outs of interrogation, I'm now sitting on the other side of the interrogation table. And there, did you know? I'm like, I didn't know. How did you guys know? Because you guys did the background. 7 weeks of federal investigation. Accounts were frozen, phones were tapped, the whole shebang. I'll never forget this. I said to myself, he fucked me. He literally fucked me. He didn't think about our children. He didn't think about my career. He was selfish, which is the mentality of a cartel member. I do what I want, I get what I want, and I get away with everything. And
he probably loved the idea that he was married to you.
Yeah. I told him he did the same thing that his father did to his mother: lie, cheat, and steal. His mom, I remember, I will never forget this, told him, why did you tell her? You could have gone another 10 years without her knowing. The mentality of their family was like, there's nothing wrong, everything is fine. But they didn't even see the graveness of me losing my entire career that I had given. Didn't even see that. They're like, oh, she'll be fine. After the 7-week investigation, they tell me, you have 2 options. You divorce him as soon as possible and disassociate yourself from the family, or you're blacklisted. Pick one. So in this moment, I'll never forget, I called the CEO of Housemarque Publishing Company and I said, give me the book back. I got 2 more chapters. I'm going to write everything that happened. And she said, Angelica, you're under federal investigation. We can't. And I said, no, this is part of my story. I get the book back. I added 2 more chapters. And book 1 ends with me going under federal investigation. And I remember the CEO being so scared. She says, I have never in my 30 years of career had this crazy ass story ever been written and it be true. So this happened February of 21. I moved out the house. I took the kids. I left this lavish lifestyle. I left everything behind and I told him, I'm not taking anything, but I need you to sign this piece of paper. And in that piece of paper, it said he was giving me authorization to write everything he told me in my book because it was part of my story. He looked at it and he's like, yeah, your stupid little book. I leave March 2021. The book publishes November of 21. And I remember him saying, your stupid little book. My book hits bestseller. And Housemarque is, I cannot believe she wrote this story. And I knew that writing my story and telling my truth would possibly impact my entire government career. The book published November of 21. December of 21, I get suspended. December passes, holidays. January of 22, I'm blacklisted. They don't say why. They said you're blacklisted. I lose my entire government career, but now I'm a best-selling author. Now people want to hear my story. Now people want me on stages and telling my story because it's unbelievable. People don't even believe it to this day.
And what is your relationship like with your husband at this point?
It's a little rocky right now. because we're in the midst of going back to court for some loose ends. But overall, it's a good relationship. The kids still get to see their father. And this is what I tell people. The government never investigated him. They never wanted to investigate him. They didn't have evidence to investigate him. You can't just go into somebody's life and say, hey, we're going to go through your accounts. It was hearsay. Nobody wanted to do anything. Everything, the investigation was on me because they thought I married in to steal secrets. And I said to them, research everything. They even heard the call of me calling my friend Gabrielle, of me in the ground, crying hysterically in the fetal position in my room, telling her, oh my God, my life is crashing down. And her telling me, you wanted to end the marriage before it even started, and I told you to marry him. That was my gut instinct that I knew I shouldn't have married into this family. So I leave, I get blacklisted, and I can't believe it.
You're divorced?
I'm divorced. I had one of the quickest divorces in Texas history. By July of 21, we were done and divorced. And never made the media until I started going around telling my story. And I'll never forget this. I reached out to Natasha Graciano here in Beverly Hills. And I said, put me on your stage. Let me tell my story. And I came. She threw me on the stage and I told my story. And people could not believe it. Till this day, people still think that I knew. People believe that I actually went into the cartel and that I was in this life knowingly and willingly. And my kids are too young to understand it, but they eventually will read the book. But one of the things that I realized is that I felt that my entire life was surrounded by the government work. And I never thought that I can be a best-selling author or I could be a motivational speaker. I never thought that I can get on stage and tell people my story of trauma from tragedy to triumph. Until this day, people still don't believe the story, and it's out there. And I still work for the government. I had agencies that came back a year later, 2 years later, and said, your work is magnificent. You are one of the best in this industry, and we will still work with you. August of 22, I signed a movie deal here in Hollywood to sell my rights to tell my story. And we're still in the process of that, but I still get emotional because it's like, how do you do that? Like, how does that happen? You only see this in the movies, but it happened. It happened to me, and I wouldn't have it any other way, because the worst thing that happened to me was the best thing that happened to me. Because now I get to tell my story, and shit like this does happen. But people don't have the guts to tell their stories. And I hope that with this interview, people will stand up and will share their stories. Because when you think that you are everything and you are in the height of your career, you lose everything to gain everything. Thanks.
What's your biggest regret in all of this?
I don't regret anything, because I healed so much from all of my trauma, my childhood trauma, that when this got put in my plate, I felt like this was a pinnacle of a new life that I was creating. So I became a bestseller. Through These Brown Eyes got blown up. I'm working on book 2, which is called The Power of Forgiveness. And I always said this. I said, you grow and you become stronger for forgiving yourself, for forgiving those that hurt you. You don't have to forgive those that hurt you. You forgive yourself. And just like I forgave the killer of my friend, I forgave my ex-husband for destroying my life. Because I was able to recreate a beautiful life now. And I'm not attached to the government anymore. And I don't regret anything, because sometimes you have to destroy things to be able to rebuild. And that's what I did. I rebuilt. I started my own divorce podcast, talking about my high profile divorce, telling people, listen, if I can get through it, you can get through it. And we called it Untying Knots. That podcast blew up. We got 10 million views in less than a year. And I literally had the biggest divorce glow up. Because what I didn't create in 10 years with that man, I created an entire empire on my own in 4 years. And I don't have any regrets. I wouldn't change anything. I would have still married him. I have my beautiful children. What I do worry about now is the story that I would tell my kids. Because I know that they probably will hate him. But I've forgiven him, and I tell them, you know, people make mistakes. This one was a big one, but I was able to have compassion for his pain because he was able to tell me his truth and lifted that weight of pain off of him. And that's why the second book is called The Power of Forgiveness, teaching people how to forgive those that had hurt us. Somebody that I thought I loved, somebody that I made children with. But let me tell you, being blacklisted is pretty damn amazing, because only there's so many people that get blacklisted. And till this day, I'm still blacklisted with that agency, but I'm still working with other 3. So when you think your life is over, it's just beginning. You just have a different face.
What is your relationship like now with your ex-husband?
It's fine. We get along. I keep him out of the media. People don't know his identity unless people know who we are. But this is the crazy part. His career exploded after my book came out. So as much as he hates me for telling the story, his career is booming. Because what people don't understand is Cartel runs a lot of Houston. Cartel members are buying buildings and businesses because we're right there by the border. The crazy part about all this is, in the midst of me being out and about and telling my story, I went to London, told my story on James English. I met Jay Flores at a conference. And I remember looking at him and being like, damn, we have a lot in common. We have more in common than I have with the actual feds. Because we came from the same neighborhood. We dealt with the same pain. We grew up with the same tragedies happening around me. He even knew about my friend getting murdered. And now Jay, who, if people don't know, him and his brother worked with the feds to try to get Chapo and gave up Chapo. And he has now transformed his life. This is somebody who literally trafficked over $168 billion of drugs. He was in charge of it. Is now getting to live his new life, teaching law enforcement how to take down cartel. So we actually have more in common now. And we're good friends. And it's crazy to me because it's like I'm in, I'm out, but I'm kind of like I'm really the black sheep, because I get down with the feds and then I get down with the street cred because I grew up in the same neighborhood dealing with the murders and the trauma. But it's almost like I don't belong, and I started my own lane. Until this day, people don't believe my crazy story, but it's definitely real. And it definitely happened to me. And now I just hope that my kids will be able to forgive their father for lying to me and them. So
I have to ask you, which operation is more corrupt? Is it the feds or the cartels?
The feds for sure.
Why do you say that?
Because if it wasn't for the feds, the cartel wouldn't exist.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Incredible story.
Crazy.
All right, Angelica, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wish you lots of luck from here on out.
Thank you. It was a lot, right?
When I was designing the first Soft White Underbelly book, I realized that there were so many great portraits that weren't going to make it into that book. They just wouldn't fit. And once I saw how well that first book sold, I knew I'd have to design a second book. This second book is finally ready to ship. Like the first one, this book has a collection of some of the best portraits from Soft White Underbelly, accompanied by a quote from that person's interview. This book features another group of Rebecca portraits, as well as a collection of color images of the Whitaker family, and plenty of others. You can order yours for $125 or $150 for a signed copy at softwhiteunderbelly.org. Again, like the first book, once this book is sold out, I will not be printing more of them. The portraits are what Soft White Underbelly is all about, and these two books contain the best of all that work. Thank you for watching.